So, I recently picked up the game SOMA, and it's really good. For those of you who don't know, SOMA is this first-person, hide-and-seek survival horror game by the same studio who made Amnesia. That was that one game where you're being followed by a ghost who kind of looks like Ezio from Assassin's Creed. This game shies away from Amnesia's European castle aesthetic and opts for a more post-apocalyptic sci-fi feel, kind of like BioShock mixed with the Alien franchise, and it works really well. In SOMA, you play as some guy who had a brain injury and chooses to get it scanned by some sketchy doctor.
Right, Dr. Munchie?
Well, it's just Mr. Munchie, but I'm working on it.
During the scan, he gets teleported to a rusty underwater research lab, because of course he does, and that's when things start getting really creepy. See, I've been a fan of horror games for a while, but I've always thought that the deep ocean aesthetic is just terrifying. But that might just be because I got really into Subnautica.
No, I just saw something. Nope. Nope. Oh my god. What?
But unlike Subnautica, SOMA takes a more narrative-driven approach to the underwater exploration by focusing on what you can hear rather than what you can see. Which is cool because when we're talking about horror games or movies, there's two things that I think should always stand out. The atmosphere, which has a lot of little parts, and the sound design. And SOMA does something incredible with its sound design. In a lot of video games, there's sound bites that designers might use to encompass a variety of situations. For example, a sound designer might make one or two sound bites for when something hits metal in the game. Whether it be a bullet, a throwing knife, or a melee attack, they'll all play a metal hitting something sound. This makes it easier for sound designers to focus on unique sound clips and tracks that ultimately should be prioritized. But SOMA goes one step further and does something a little different. In SOMA, you can interact with, pick up, and throw around a ton of different objects. For example, every object that you see in this picture is something that you can pick up, examine, and throw on the ground. But when you drop an object on the ground in SOMA, something crazy happens. Okay, maybe that didn't seem too crazy, but let me explain. When you pick up a metal drill in this game and drop it, you don't get a generic something hitting the ground sound clip. You get a clip that sounds exactly like a metal drill hitting the ground in real life. The same thing happens when you throw a glass cup on the ground, or a syringe, or anything really. There's a unique hitting the ground sound clip for almost every single object that you can pick up in this game. Throw a stapler on the ground, you get a clip that sounds exactly like a stapler hitting the ground. Throw a mug with a butter knife on the ground. Okay, maybe that wasn't the best example, but there are so many objects in this game that you can pick up and drop that it makes you wonder how much time it must have taken to record everything. I was thinking maybe the developers used some of their budget to buy the objects that you can interact with in this game in real life, and then they just like recorded themselves throwing it on the ground, which is probably what they didn't do. They probably used like a sound library or something. But it's one of the many things that makes SOMA one of my favorite horror games of all time. I've always thought that sound design is super important in media, especially in a genre that's trying to build up your anxiety. One way developers might build up a better atmosphere in a horror game is through ambient noise, which is pretty much just background noise, kind of like a fan being on in a room or the rustling of leaves on a tree outside. You might notice that in most movies or games, there's hardly ever silence. When you take the background noise out of a scene and just include the dialogue, in most cases, it can make things sound really awkward and artificial, which is something you definitely want to avoid if you're focusing on the atmosphere. Now, this game isn't revolutionary with its ambient noise, but it's terrifying. For example, a good chunk of this game has these underwater sections where you have to go from point A to point B while exploring the bottom of the ocean. During these segments, there's so much going on sonically that it makes getting immersed really easy. Seriously, just take a listen to all the little things that you can hear when you're underwater.
Unable to activate. Escape vessel. Protocol missing.
Like I said, there's so many little things that you can hear that add so much. The calm but constant inner workings of your mechanical suit, Simon's heavy, almost panicked breathing, and the very faint rush of water moving around him create the foundation for a super creepy atmosphere. Even more impressive is the ambiance inside of Pathos 2, which is the underwater research lab that the game takes place in. Isn't that just so scary? It's almost like there's always something that you can hear behind you in this game, whether it be the humming of a computer fan or the dripping ooze of this robotic cancer taking over Pathos 2. Now, I know it sounds like I'm gushing and I'm just totally in love with this game, which I kind of am, but it does have its fair share of flaws. Its enemy encounters are really weak, and some of them almost feel like a chore to get through. It also has some really horrible puzzle segments where the whole puzzle feels like you're just looking for something to interact with, but the sounds that you hear when you're playing this game are so good that it makes it hard to even notice how tedious some parts of it can get. And this is true for other horror games and movies. I mean, have you ever seen the movie Sinister? It definitely has a subpar script and some really unfair jump scares, especially during the second half, but its soundtrack really glued it together and turned it into what some might call a horror classic. I mean, I still close my eyes during the lawnmower scene in that movie. What's really odd is that when you look up reviews for Sinister, which were really mixed, you almost see no mention of its soundtrack. The same thing happens when you look up reviews for SOMA. I looked at so many pages and I couldn't find anything mentioning SOMA's sound design. It really makes you wish that the critics who review these games and movies would at least take a second to comment on the sounds that are in it. Maybe we just need an Anthony Fantano for video game music or something. But I could gush about the sounds in SOMA or the game as a whole for hours. I mean, I haven't even touched on its story that made it hard to sleep for a few days, but I'd hate to spoil too much to anybody who hasn't tried it yet. All I can say is, if you like horror games, I would suggest putting on some headphones, closing those blinds, and immersing yourself in the world that is SOMA.